to get through. We have started recording. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me once again, round 2 of DrugsCo. For those of you who are new here and for those of you who aren't, just a couple of quick disclaimers about class today as I plug in my lights. As always, this is a personal project that is not directly affiliated with DanceSafe. I am an employee of DanceSafe. Please, if you can, try to internally break that marriage between me and organization. This still remains a pilot program for DanceSafe's normal programming. Additionally, please make sure that you always check out the About and Info tab on the DrugsCo website so you can get an idea for my credentialing, my background, and as always, if you have any comments, complaints, concerns with the way that I present any information of any topic in this class, please feel free. Oh yes, that's right, I'm using a different Zoom account. Thank you for pointing that out. I use she, her pronouns. So please keep all that in mind as we do this. If you have things that you want to point out during class, things that you want to add, if they're not pressing or you just have additional information, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also unmute yourself and pop in if there's something immediate or urgent that you want to mention. Just keep in mind for a lot of this stuff, I had a couple people email me after last class with some things that they wanted to bring up. Just remember that all of the stuff we're covering right now is just to get the groundwork done. So if I go a little bit into something and don't fully flesh it out, it's probably going to be returned to later. Don't worry about that. Without further ado, let's get started. I'm so sorry you guys have to see all of these tabs. And please make sure to mute yourselves if you have not already. Thank you, Matt. Okay, so today we are going to be going over the basics of harm reduction and two concepts that some of you who are already familiar with harm reduction might not actually be familiar with yet, which is risk reduction and benefit maximization. And this is a direction that we're kind of moving in as a movement in some areas. This is not for everyone, obviously, because harm reduction has very politically motivated and oriented roots. So harm reduction as its own practice is extremely important socially and culturally, and this is in no way detracting from that. But there are a couple of alternative approaches to harm reduction that are currently being discussed. And today we're also going to play my favorite game, which is Name That Drug, and go into the concept of purity a little bit. And the concept of purity is something that is super important for anyone who's interested in this subject to know about if you are even remotely participating in the illicit market. And just a quick note about the phrase illicit market. I encourage you, if you're using the phrase black market right now, to consider switching over to illicit market. As with many things in substances, you'll find the more you dig into this, the more kind of like derogatory and racialized undertones that there are in a lot of the language that we use to refer to people that use drugs and certain drugs, and also just like the environments in which drugs percolate. So keep that in mind. Language is important and it's powerful and it changes people's brain structures. So the language you use really does matter. So if it seems nitpicky, there's a good reason for it. Just a quick recap of last time. Just let's create some chaos in here. Unmute yourselves and quietly whisper the name of the categorizations so that it's not crazy, overwhelmingly loud. Categorizations of drugs. Go ahead.
Opiates.
Inhalants.
Okay.
Stimulants.
All right.
Hallucinogens.
Cool.
Depressants.
My favorite way to do this because it's useless. Like, I don't know if any of you could hear most of those things, but I could. But like, I love hearing all of your voices and not knowing who they're attributed to, and eventually over time I will. So I heard a lot of the major ones. We got stimulants and inhalants, cannabinoids and opioids, otherwise known as narcotics or analgesics, depending on who you're talking to. Hallucinogens, dissociatives.
You look like you're a natural blonde.
Please make sure to mute yourselves if you're
I'm a natural blonde too, so it's like
I might have to go through and mute everyone. And depressants, all right? And then there are 5 generalized classifications of scheduling under the US government as determined by potential for abuse, which is an undefined metric as of right now and always has been, as well as potential for medical application. So Schedule 1 substance, by the US government at least, has no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. And Schedule 2 substances, high potential for abuse, but some currently accepted medical use. And then from there, it goes further down. Remember that the significance behind this isn't necessarily in that Schedule 1 drugs are more illegal per se than Schedule 2 drugs necessarily. It's more that the scheduling impacts the accessibility of research, of production, the means of control, for instance. So that's very relevant when we're talking about descheduling or rescheduling, because if you can't access the research, you can't do the rescheduling, or you can't as easily. So that's something to keep in mind. Question, is cannabis a cannabinoid? You can
No.
thumb or in the chat or say it out loud, whatever you want.
No.
I hear a couple of no's. That's right. Cannabis is not a cannabinoid.
Contains cannabinoids.
That's right. Thank you so much. Cannabis contains cannabinoids, and there are also synthetic cannabinoids, which are things that have been created in a lab to emulate the effects of usually THC, sometimes other cannabinoids. What schedule indicates that, according to legislatures, something has a high potential for abuse, but some medical value? You can just hold up your fingers or say in the chat or say it out loud, whatever you want. Yes, I see. Schedule 2, that's right. Who implemented the Controlled Substances Act of 1971? Everyone's favorite president?
Evil Reagan.
It was not Reagan. It was not Reagan.
Nixon.
It was Nixon, that's right. So Reagan came later. Reagan was in the 80s, and we'll come back to Reagan as well because he played a different role in taking this existing concept of the Controlled Substances Act and starting the war on drugs as we know it and propagating it, getting the ball rolling, making those creepy announcements. What are they called? They're infomercials, I guess, about substances. That led to the more fun ones, like the guy that cracks the egg into the skillets, like, this is your brain on drugs. For any of you who are familiar with the artist Cyril, there's a song called Public Service Announcement. There's a happy hardcore song that uses that. It's completely irrelevant. It's just in case you're wondering. What is it called if your pupils are dilated, if they are blown out, so to speak?
Myiasis.
You're super close, super close.
Mydriasis?
That's right, mydriasis. You almost got it. That's very, very close. Does anyone remember which 2 categories of substances primarily will cause mydriasis? Primarily.
Stimulants and hallucinogens.
That's correct. Thank you very much. Stimulants and hallucinogens from mydriasis. What about pupil constriction? What is that one?
Opioids or opiates.
That's well, it's opioids as a whole. That was an interesting catch that you just did. Can anyone tell me the difference between opioid and opiate?
One is the alkaloid and then one is the like family.
That's correct. And I'm going to ask someone else to answer this one. You've been killing it. Thank you so much. The difference between, or I'm sorry, can someone make the distinction? Which is the family and which is the alkaloid? Anyone remember?
The
Opioid.
Sorry, I know it's a bit chaotic in Zoom.
Yeah, the opioid is the family, and the opiate is the derivative from the poppy opium plant.
Exactly. So opioid, big category, opiate, smaller category within this great way of differentiating news sources. And then what is it called when you have jaw clenching, tooth grinding? Starts with a B. Anyone know that?
Bruxism.
That's right, bruxism. Thank you very much. Okay, which 2 categories primarily will cause bruxism?
Stimulants.
That's right.
And, no.
To a lesser extent.
Hallucinogens?
Yes, and someone got it right in the chat. Nice job, guys. Stimulants and hallucinogens, that's correct. So hallucinogens are kind of a lower likelihood of severe bruxism, but you can totally get it. A lot of people will find that, especially after like a really long night of high doses of LSD, they'll have kind of a little bit of pain on their insides of their mouth. This is mostly common from Molly. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this effect. I've seen some pretty fucked up, chewed up tongues and gums, and sometimes people like bite a little bit of their tongue off. I've seen that happen before. There is some speculation that taking a certain kind of bioavailable magnesium can kind of protect against this effect, but as with all supplementation with substances, it is basically all a shot in the dark right now, so have fun. Magnesium might make your poop soft, so just be aware of that one if you're using porta potties while you're at it. All right, so
Excuse me.
yes.
I have a question. Do you know why hallucinogens and stimulants both have the bruxism effect? Because if you look at acid and mushrooms and Molly, they all affect like the same serotonin system. So maybe does it have something to do with that, or is it just a shot in the dark?
This is a question that I knew the answer to a long time ago and have since not entirely forgotten, but I don't want to speak confidently on it without being able to cite my sources. So if you could do me a favor and send me an email asking that same question, I will pull my sources, confirm my information, and send it your way. I think that that's correct. I do believe that it is a serotonergic activity. If anyone has information on this, yeah, I'm fairly certain that it is like a serotonergic effect, but I want to be positive before I say anything. So please email me and I will fact check myself. Quick recap. Routes of administration include insufflation. Now, technically, insufflation is blowing something into a cavity, not sucking it into a cavity. So this is like an interesting distinction that the drug community doesn't actually make. You can just call it insufflation. Everyone will know what you're talking about, but it's cool to know that. Then there's transdermal administration, which is pretty uncommon. I'm going to say something that might make a couple of you mad, but no, you cannot actually absorb LSD through your skin. I'm sorry, I know I'm probably going to get a lot of people going, yes, you can, my buddy did it. The fact of the matter is that your skin is intended to keep stuff like acid out. It's not going to work. I can tell you exactly how I know this, which is that I know someone who used to be a fluff manufacturer who used to make crystalline LSD in a lab, and they could hold it in their hands all day and not get high. Fluff, which is millions of hits of LSD in their hands and not get high. But if you scratch your nose, if you touch your eyes, if you go pee, then you have a high risk of touching a mucous membrane. So they would actually tie their hands to their belt loops to prevent themselves from touching their faces accidentally while in the lab. Add me on that one. Okay, sublingual, which is when you put it underneath your tongue because there are a lot of
I have
blood
a
vessels.
question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. On the last one where you're saying you can't get high from LSD through the skin, if there's an open wound, like a cut, would you be able to get high through that? Or
That's a really interesting question that I
'cause
also don't know the answer to. That's possible.
there's the whole story with Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock cutting his forehead and
That one is
no.
definitely bunked. And that is partly because, holy shit, what a waste of acid. Oh my God, you'd have to put so many drops of acid on your headband for it to actually be functional in that way. Albert Hoffman accidentally dosing with LSD. The thing about that is that people really underestimate how much they touch their own faces. Like you can be completely unaware of it, something subtle, and then you move it. Who knows? It could be like quite a long time afterwards. So a lot of people that are a lot of people that are convinced that they dose through their skin actually just weren't aware of it when they touched a mucous membrane. So keep that one in mind. And then there's IV or banging or mainlining or shooting up. This is a terrible stock image. I hate stock images of substances. I just put that in there to talk about it. And then suppository if you want. Some lesser common ones are enema, which is injecting a gas into the rectum, or I'm sorry, liquid into the rectum, or gas, I think. And then there's also huffing. Oh my God, I just did the thing where I stuck the zoom bar to the bottom and now I can't unstick it. How have I gone this long and still have this problem? There we go. Right, so major difference between an inhalant and something that you smoke is combustion. You have to add heating or burning to something that you smoke. If you can just inhale it straight, it's an inhalant. Okay, I'm taking too long. What is harm reduction? I'm going to kind of blow through this a little bit because I don't want to get you guys caught up on the definitions part of things. The gist of harm reduction is that we recognize that people do things that they do. Those things might be risky. Those things might incur harm. So we're going to, instead of trying to get them to not do those things, which is an abstinence-based approach that statistically does not work whatsoever. There's a lot of literature behind this, a lot. Harm reduction seeks to go in and be like, we're going to give people the tools to make decisions in ways that are going to benefit them, basically. And this specifically comes out in the form of supporting people that use drugs as being human beings. And this involves using things like person-centric language, which is where you say a person who uses drugs, not a junkie, not a crackhead, which has historically been used as a racial slur. You should eliminate that from your vocabulary. Not a tweaker. People are people first and foremost. You probably don't know them. And this is a really major thing we're going to come back to later, but getting in the practice of referring to people by their character as opposed to their drug use is really important in unsticking this kind of social idea that we have that people are less than, especially that people are less than if their relationship with substances is causing them harm. That doesn't make them a bad person necessarily, you know? And then in addition to this, getting people information so they can make informed decisions, and also finding solutions instead of shaming. If someone has a problematic or chaotic or excessive relationship with substances, and they come to you and they say, this is my situation, and you say, you're an idiot, how did you get yourself in that position? That literally does not help anyone. And it's so deeply ingrained in us to be punitive, to be judgmental, to punish people for those decisions, that we kind of are blinded to the fact that it just does not actually solve the problem. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the goal here? What is actually the goal here? Is the goal to push a message to retain a moral high ground, or is the goal to actually reduce the casualties affiliated with risky behavior? That's the question that we ask ourselves. So to do this, harm reduction is basically being like, okay, there are harms being caused by this thing. How do we make those harms lesser? It's kind of backpedaling a little bit. So that can be in the form of needle exchanges, so people aren't using contaminated syringes, which is a major, major cause of problems pertaining to injection drug use. And then opioid reversal and overdose prevention training, which is kind of like, if you OD, we're going to take care of it. And then there's replacement therapies. These are examples for opioid related things, right? And this class isn't all about opioids, but this is a very specific application of harm reduction that's very visible. Now, here's where I kind of want to start moving the direction a little bit. The phrase of harm reduction pertaining to drug use in some ways implies that drug use is inherently harmful and that people need to be protected from the inherent and inevitable harm of doing drugs. I challenge this notion. I challenge this notion by saying that if we know that there are risks affiliated with an activity, we can, instead of being like, okay, we're going to be harmed, let's be harmed less, say we're going to reduce the baseline level of risk associated with what we're doing right now. So this can come in the form of knowing your interactions, knowing how to respond to an emergency, and using drug checking, for instance. The risk is here, we do a thing, the risk is lower. It doesn't eliminate the risk. All drug use is inherently risky. To be frank, being alive is pretty fucking risky, to be honest. Now, the other side of the coin here is benefit maximization, which is not only acknowledging that drug use doesn't necessarily inevitably mean harm, but also that people can benefit from it. And I'm curious how some people in here feel about that statement. We have people in this class whose backgrounds are all over the map, who probably have very differing opinions about this kind of stuff. Also, the last lecture, I have absolutely no idea when the last lecture is going to be. No idea. This class can take any amount of time. So we do benefit maximization by doing things like preparing for an experience you're going to have by consuming as much information as you can about it, or doing a substance repeatedly and taking note every time of how a particular dosage impacts you and how your setting impacts you so you can optimize this. So this is kind of an optimization process. And then also thinking about how and why you're doing substances. And I don't know about you guys, but normally my brain would look at something like that and kind of immediately blow past it and be like, this is basic. Like, this is 101. Like, I don't need to think about why I'm smoking weed every time I smoke weed. But it's not about that. It's just about utilizing the practice of ingesting substances as a means of checking in with yourself as a human being, as a person that is ingesting something, just in general, like how is your day and how is substance use playing into that, just to keep track of it. It's really interesting. It's surprisingly interesting. Oops. So there are tons of programs available. We're not going to go into them right now, just a general outline of what is out there in case you're not already familiar. There are medication-assisted recovery services, detox programs, addiction programs. This is for recovery and support, right? This is for, generally speaking, these kinds of programs are for people that are currently experiencing harm and are trying to reduce that harm. These are more harm reduction-oriented facilities and activities. The National Harm Reduction Coalition is amazing, and they span a lot of different categories. I really recommend checking them out as kind of a holistic resource if you get the opportunity to. Now, some ways that this could be exemplified are through things like the IDEA Mobile Needle Exchange in Florida. And the point of having this kind of thing is that you can basically acquire the supplies that might be too difficult for you to get on your own to reduce the harms affiliated with what you're doing. So in this case, it's sterile injection supplies or sober support staff that can engage in opioid overdose reversal if need be. And also just like helping people identify things like missed veins or blown veins and stuff like that. Also giving out safer sex supplies and sanitation. But here's something that I want to touch on briefly. And we're going to come back to this in great, great detail. Just for the time being, harm reduction saves us a lot of fucking money. Now, the question is, the US government, we know this, the US government loves money. Oh my God. I have not met an entity except Jeff Bezos that likes money as much as the United States government. Now, the question is, why aren't we doing it then, if that's the case? Let's look at Australia real quick. This is from a couple of years ago. Australia, for every $1 NSP is, oh my God, this acronym is like really escaping me. Syringe, it's a syringe exchange program, basically. I can't believe this acronym is just like out of my mind right now. For every $1 basically spent on harm reduction through syringe exchange, you save $4 on health costs and $27 on lost productivity and health costs. Yet, in the pie of what money is spent on harm reduction, it's almost none of it. If someone could tell me what this acronym is that I can't remember, that would be great. Needle syringe, thank you very much. Needle syringe program, thank you. That's like killing me. So despite this fact, we're spending almost nothing, this is Australia, is still spending almost nothing on harm reduction and most of the money on treatment and on law enforcement. So it's kind of like you're standing at the bottom of a stream and there are tons of dead fish floating past you and you're like, oh man, I should keep pulling these fish out of the river. And every time you're like, oh, another dead fish, this is crazy. I don't know, why are all the fish dead? And you never even think to go upstream to figure out why the fish are dying in the first place. And that's what we do. But it's working as intended, which is the worst part of this. Law enforcement getting the most funding is exactly what the system is built to do. This isn't an accident. This is just the system engaging in its current affairs, basically. Do a whole section on that one. Now, in Australia in particular, a major way that this is visualized is in HIV rates. And HIV rates are pretty directly correlated with the lack of accessibility to clean needles in many countries around the world. And that's a generalization, obviously, but new HIV cases are very, very, very strongly tied to people's access to clean needle supplies. If you're sharing syringes because you don't have access to new syringes, then that's a recipe for bloodborne diseases. So there's also a clear correlation between countries that have more prominent harm reduction measures, including access to these things, and countries with less access to these kinds of harm reduction measures in terms of HIV. If we shifted 10%, just 10% of our funds from drug control to harm reduction, we would see a 94% drop in new HIV infections. Now, again, I know that a lot of you that are here are probably like, okay, where's the drug science? I want to talk about the drug science. I want to know how the drugs work in my body. That's what I'm here for. I get that. I used to feel the same way. But let me pose this to you as this concept of intersectionality that some of you might be more interested as of right now than others. I hope to get you all into this concept because it's so wild. So we look at something like HIV, right? We start with opioid use, for instance. That's just, commonly injected substances, but you can inject a lot of different things. You look at lack of access to clean needles. And then from there, you look at increasing HIV rates. From there, you look at increased individual costs of healthcare. From there, you look at debt. From there, you look at racial disparities in access to healthcare and in racism in the healthcare system. From there, you look at lack of ability to pay mortgage or rent and have access to basic necessities. From there, you look at things like incarceration due to lack of access to resources to pay bills, etc. From there, you look at incarceration for using substances in the first place. From there, you look at not being able to get jobs because you have that criminal record from using substances in the first place, reduces your access to income, reduces your access to necessities, reduces your access to pretty much everything from there on out. This is a tumbling, snowballing circle. It's not as simple as one person uses a drug. A butterfly flaps its wings and the whole world changes. Now, looking at this more numerically, because Americans love money, right? This is the amount of additional investment in harm reduction that we would need. And in return, we would save so much cheddar on treatment costs, so much money that's going into currently treating things that could be avoided in the first place. Syringe exchange programs, SEPs, save millions and millions of dollars on this, but we have limited access to them. They could do a lot more. That was weird. Now, one part of this that, again, we're going to come back to in greater detail later is the incarceration system. And this is one that I could go on about for days, and I will. Isn't that convenient? So the incarceration rate, as soon as the Reagans stepped into office, skyrocketed. We spent so much money and energy and time on law enforcement, on incarcerating people for drug use. And a lot of our money goes into funding prisons for drug offenders. Nonviolent drug offenders make up the majority of federal inmates. Nonviolent drug offenders. We'll come back to why that's really interesting and the scandal of the prison industrial complex and the 13th Amendment in a little bit. But first off, Mark Tyndall. A great TED Talk, highly recommend.
Injection site in Vancouver.
Oh shit. Criminalization is just a way to institutionalize stigma. More later in this course. And now just plowing through a couple of other things before we get to name that drug. A couple of the organizations, if you're not familiar with them already, that are currently involved in the more research and therapeutic and nightlife safety oriented side of things are MAPS, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We'll come back to them. Dance Safe, who I hope you're all familiar with and love, maybe, hopefully. Zendo, who provides psychedelic crisis services, or it's psychological peer support, but a lot of people that are on acid go there. Pillreports.net, ecstasydata.org. So examples of how this would play out in these settings is, for instance, Dance Safe provides free, unbiased, non-judgmental peer education about substances and free earplugs and condoms and sunscreen and drug information cards, and in many cases, we test your drugs on site for free. Now, this is something that's been expanded across the world recently, but still remains largely a guerrilla effort because there are so many pieces of legislature in place to prevent it. There are also things like just free water and shade at events. It's harm reduction. You know, these basic measures of protecting people's health are harm reduction, and they're pretty often neglected. Anyone know where this is? Just immediately by looking at it?
Burning Man.
That's Burning Man. That's right. You can immediately tell because they look like they've been put through a lawnmower full of dust recently. Zendo is basically a place where you go where you need psychological care or support, and people will often roll up and provide a listening ear for you. This can involve psychedelic crisis or just personally feeling ungrounded. Ecstasydata.org is now drugsdata.org. It's a project of Arrowhead. If you're not familiar with Arrowhead, you should go get familiar with it immediately and spend 16 hours reading everything in the experience vaults until your eyes bleed, because that's my favorite thing to do, and I hope it becomes yours as well. Ecstasy data, or drugs data as it now is a subset of the Arrowhead project where you can actually send in a sample of your substance to them. It's like $100-$150, and they will use advanced lab technology to identify what's in it. Now, this is different than any at-home test you can get, which I have a lot to say about. And this is like actual definitive testing. This is affirmative testing. This means that if you send it in and they say, this contains this, it contains that. If you test at home, you're basically testing to see if what you have is mostly not what you want. And we'll come back to that. I'll do a whole demo on how to use our kits, etc. later. Speaking of which, our kits. This is the next best line of defense for using at home. Purchasing a drug checking kit, especially right now, there have been a spate of overdose deaths from fentanyl and ketamine in North Carolina in the last 3 days. Be safe, spread the message to your friends. And this is everywhere. This is not just North Carolina. Like, you need to be using fent strips and testing your substances right now. It's incredibly, incredibly saturated on the illicit market. So the US has rudimentary stuff like this, kind of underground, where people go to events. In Russia, it's also kind of rudimentary and underground. Russia's really, really, really having a hard time getting access to things like this, but they're also having kind of their own opioid and benzo crisis as well. And then in the UK is like, fuck it, let's put up like actual brick and mortar establishments. In some places, it's just, it's in its infancy. And places like Vienna have similar things to the US. These are just some examples of where harm reduction can be implemented and has been implemented. Now, oh yeah, Psychonaut Wiki. If you go to the resources tab on the website, all my favorite drug-oriented pages are there. Spend 5 days on it. It'll be worth your time. I'm sure many of you have your minds on the RAVE Act right now. The number of people that have contacted us and said, dance safe, dance safe, dance safe. Aren't we mad that Joe Biden's president? And the fact of the matter is that right now I want to separate like the entire election from this current topic that we're talking about. I know it's tempting to get into discussions about Biden and his policy. For now, I just want to talk about what this is. In 2002, Joe Biden introduced the RAVE Act, which hilariously to me is called Reducing Americans' Vulnerability to Ecstasy Act. And I always imagine this like beefy Molly pill rolling up to your door with Mickey Mouse gloves and knocking on it and being like, oh, I'm gonna fuck you up. And then Joe Biden steps in and is like, no, no, no ecstasy for you. We're safe here with our not water and our hot environments and our neurotoxicity. We're safe now. And this act caused so many problems because it basically, not directly, no one's ever been persecuted through the RAVE Act, which is funny for like providing drug paraphernalia at their events, but it basically set the stage for promoters to be afraid of allowing anything at their events that could be construed as condoning drug use. And this led a couple of very disgruntled parents to start the Amend the RAVE Act campaign because their own children had been subjected to this by events that didn't provide cool down stations or free water, for instance, because they thought that they could be persecuted under the RAVE Act. Prosecuted, not persecuted, under the RAVE Act. So let's take a look at how this was done differently. Boomtown,
I think addressing
2017. Drug
when
checking.
somebody comes in, they will come over to our intake booth. We'll have one of our members of staff will be sitting here who will ask them, have you got a sample to drop off with us today? And they will put a little bit, about 1/20th of a gram into their sample bag. And somebody will come out every 5 minutes from the lab and take those samples through so that we can run them through the analysis process.
When we get a sample in, first it goes into the sample tray just here. Then we put a little bit on the sample stage of our infrared spectrum. What then happens is it shoots a beam of infrared light at our sample. That then creates a unique fingerprint, which we match against our database of lots of legal and illegal drugs and other substances. And if it matches any of them, then it will tell us hopefully what it is. And we can also find out what else might be in it. This sample was meant to be, what was it meant to be?
It's a pill with MDMA.
It's meant to be a pill, and it seems to just contain lactose.
Actually, it was bought as Chinese Valium.
So this is the kind of stuff that could be available. Dance Safe just got our hands on 2 FTIR machines. So we will have that kind of technology coming to an event near you soon. When the fog lifts, I suppose. So let's take a look at MAPS. And again, I know that some of you might be familiar with all these. Just bear with me. We're getting the groundwork laid. There are people of all backgrounds in this class right now. So MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They are currently in stage 3 clinical trials of treating PTSD with MDMA. And every time I say that, I almost cry. And sometimes I actually cry and I have to leave the room. MAPS is known for doing research in particular on MDMA. However, they've also been carrying out clinical trials on things like LSD and psilocybin for depression and ayahuasca for the treatment of addiction and PTSD. So part of their job in this network is basically to start incorporating and medicalizing, which is a sticky subject that involves a lot of connotations that we'll come back to. Do not support psychedelic capitalism. And assisted therapy as well. So training people to be practitioners. A major criticism that MAPS has faced is that they do not suitably address the need for BIPOC participants in their studies, and they do not suitably support BIPOC practitioners. This is a major issue that they've been kind of not doing a great job of rectifying, but
they don't, wait, sorry, what?
BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So MAPS has been taking a lot of heat for that. And they've been kind of doing some steps to mitigate the situation, but we're keeping an eye on it. And then also providing education for the public. MAPS has provided an incredible array of services and done an amazing quantity and caliber of research on these subjects. So hopefully this ends up well. Now it's time for Name That Drug. I'm so happy to have you all here. I'll be your host. You can call me Sputnik. I use she, her pronouns, and let's play Name That Drug, where you attempt badly to identify substances using only your eyeballs. Are we ready to play Name That Drug? Sick. All right. Any guesses? What is on the left? You can put it in the chat. You can shout it out. What do you think is on the left? Just guess.
Molly.
Molly.
Ephedrine.
Ephedrine. It's MDMA.
You don't? Ah.
You got it. It's MDMA. That's awesome. Woo. Wow. All right. What's in the middle?
Crystal meth or MDMA.
Ketamine. PCB.
Okay. All right. Oh, it's MDMA. Oh, wow. Wow. That's incredible. What about on the right? What do you think is on the right? Oh. I see PCP, baking soda, that RC that begins with an A, 2-FMA. Oh, it's TFMPP, MDMA, and methylsulfonomethane. Methylsulfonomethane is a dietary supplement, so it doesn't really do much to you. But TFMPP is a piperazine, and piperazines can cause extraordinarily unpleasant physiological effects that can become dangerous when you combine them with Molly. Uh-oh. What is this SpongeBob press pill?
Ecstasy.
Ecstasy?
2CB.
2CB. Oh, it's MDMA. I got you. It's just Molly this time. What about this thing in the middle? I see meth. I see MDA. What's this press crown? Methamphetamine. At this point, everyone gets tired of guessing because they're like, fuck you. We know it's going to be like, we don't know what it is. Like, we get the point.
MDMA.
Oh, it's MCPP, metoclopramide, and domperidone. Ooh, I don't even remember what those two bottom ones are, to be honest with you. And that's significant because my lexicon of different drugs is pretty big.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
What about stomach pill?
A stomach pill? Okay, good. That's good now. Now we have a Tesla on the right. But okay, we all know Teslas though, or like not all of us know Teslas. Many of us know Teslas, the beloved press. So what do we think that one is?
Lithium.
Lithium, meth.
BKEBBD.
BKEBD. I love that one.
Yep.
It's actually just caffeine and meth. Let's have another
Wow
for that one. So this is a major problem that I see a lot in rave communities where people are like, I got orange Teslas, I am set. And I'm like, that's sick. It means literally nothing. The most that you can possibly do is do a kind of geographic regional scan by looking on drugs data and seeing if someone had submitted one from your area and if it looks identical. And even that means jack shit. Pills can take on different textures and crumbliness if they're in a bag with something else, if they were pressed in a humid environment, if they were pressed using a press that wasn't supposed to press what it's pressing. Like, pills are complicated and you have to be nice to them. What do we think is on the left? White powder. I mean, there's only one thing it could be. I heard Coke. I heard wow, baby powder, levamisole, thiodiazepine.
Ketamine?
Ketamine? It's lidocaine. Lidocaine is a topical numbing agent. Now, the thing about lidocaine is it's not supposed to be swallowed. So this is part of the reason why people will cut their powders, their Coke specifically with lidocaine, is to emulate that numbing effect from cocaine, because people will do it and they'll be like, oh yeah, it's good, it's fire, I feel it. All it's doing is numbing your palate, and it's not good for your stomach. It's not supposed to be ingested that way. So ixnay on lidocaine. Whoops, I gave that one away. It's cocaine. Everyone's probably tired of guessing at this point anyway, unless you're just having fun saying all the research chemicals you know, in which case I'll give you this last one. What's on the right?
Cocaine or crack.
Cocaine, crack, fish scale, phenibut. Okay, that's crack. But the thing is that a lot of people cook down things like lidocaine and levamisole specifically to give crack cocaine rocks that fish scale texture to make it look shiny and nice and like it's good quality crack. You can emulate almost any drug using almost any other drug is what I'm getting at here. Yeah, this is gumming. Gumming is when you just put it on your gums. And a lot of people do this to try and see if their powder numbs them. This is an incredibly unreliable method because a lot of things will numb you if you rub them on your gums, including like cloves. I saw a question in here about aren't Tesla's ecstasy though? Had no idea it had meth. That's exactly the thing. So if someone knows that a particular press of a pill is popular and that people trust it, you can just make your own pill press that uses that same press and that same color. You could put literally anything you want, except probably like grass. I think that'd be pretty obvious. And I'm referring to like land grass, you know, like, or like a crushed White Claw can that probably wouldn't go very well in a pressy, but you can press a lot of different stuff into pill form. What do we think is on the left?
30 milligram Adderall.
30 milligram Adderall, going once, going twice. Oh, it's meth. All right, what do we have on the right here? It's got an AD on it. Come on, guys.
That might be.
Think that one's Adderall?
Is that the Adderall?
Meth again, also meth. I've seen photos of Cheeto powder pressed into 2 milligram Xanax bars.
Fucking meth.
I want to know what kind of subreddits you're crawling on. This one is, oh, it's another strawberry. That's just caffeine and methamphetamine. So that's exactly what I'm getting at here, is that people really tend to trust pharmaceutical presses. And this is especially prevalent for things like bars. The number of adulterated Xanax bars and of 30 milligram oxys is way, way, way higher than the actual number of legitimate either of those things that's on the market right now. Blotter paper. This one should be a bit easier, right? Like what's on the left?
Acid.
I'm just showing a culture of distrust right now, aren't I? Everyone's like, I don't know what you're fucking trying to pull on me right now. And that's DOC. Oh, God, DOC. Some of you might be familiar with DOC. DOC is in the family, the DOX family. It's a family of lesser known psychedelics that can last for up to 24 to 36 hours in some cases. Usually more in the 12 to 24 hour range. I think DOC is a little on the lower end, but people that aren't expecting to be tripping for that long don't want to show up to their office party high on DOC. So it's good to have informed consent here. What do we think is on the right? I see 1P LSD.
Acid.
LSD, Tizolam, that's NBOM. We're going to come back to 25I NBOM later. We are unfortunately seeing a rise of it on the market again. Just a preemptive comment, if it's bitter, it's a spitter. If you have a tab that has a strong metallic bitter taste, most likely it is not, in fact, definitely it is not LSD. That's a pretty immediate indicator. If your tab makes you, you should probably spit it out and reevaluate. Or if you want to, full send. I mean, it's up to you, but like know what you're getting into. Now, most of the time, are most of the NBOMs scheduled in the US? I don't believe so. I do not believe so. I'm not positive, but I don't think so. Yeah, LSD should be tasteless. Sublingual administration is most commonly used with things like LSD. You put it under your tongue, you hold it there because the blood vessels are so immediately close to the surface. Now let's get to a topic that I love. I love this one because, oh man, do I have to explain this a lot at work. So purity, this concept of purity. If someone comes up to me and they say, this Molly is 98% pure, my immediate response is, how the fuck do you know that? First of all. Second of all, what does that mean to you? And sometimes the person will be like, well, my guy tested it. Immediate red flag that you can't do that. You cannot test for the purity of substance unless you're using GCMS, which is advanced lab technology. You cannot do it. It's impossible, including using at-home purity tests. They don't work. Do not fall for at-home purity tests. They are patently unreliable. If someone says I have 98% pure Molly, and I'm like, oh yeah, and they're like, yeah, it's a rock and it contains 98% MDMA. I'll be like, that's interesting because MDMA becomes a freebase at 84% purity. So like, what exactly are you referencing here? Or they might say 98% of this bag is MDMA, in which case I'm like, wow, did you like watch the guy cut 2% of that bag as something else? In which case your dealer is really nice to let you watch that process happen. So this is one of those things where I like to nitpick on it. The question about if at home purity tests are unreliable, what should you be using? You just can't tell what the purity is. The best that you can do is use an at-home reagent test or fentanyl strip test or both. And that gives you an idea of whether or not your substance is definitely not what you want. That's the best we can do. I hate to say it, but that's the best we can do. If you really want to, you can send a sample into drugs data. It's pricey, but it's worth it if you get a big batch of something. Now, the ways that I am going to define purity going forward, the first is whether or not something contains binders, which are otherwise known as diluters or fillers. And these are inactive ingredients. They don't do anything and they serve a purpose. We'll come to that in just a second. But binders are inactive and they're included with your active substance. Then there are impurities, and impurities are stuff that's in your substance that are a product of its manufacturing. And that can either be like an impurity that just happened while the drug was being made, sometimes in higher or lower degrees, depending on how well the drug was made, or something that was a product of the environment that the drug was made in. We'll come back to that in a second as well. And then it could also be adulterated. And if something is adulterated, it generally means that another psychoactive substance was cut into it, was added to it. So this is a distinction that I like to make because if something was bulked, it means that there's just not a lot of the active ingredient in it. There's a lot of other stuff. If something was adulterated or cut, it means that there's the active ingredient or not, as well as other things that you didn't bargain for that will have an effect on you. That's the distinction. Check. Yeah, we'll talk all about at-home testing later. So binders or excipients, as they're known in the pharmaceutical industry, are inactive ingredients again, right? They don't actually do anything. And in some cases, this can be something as simple as baking powder or baking soda, which is cut into cocaine. It looks white, it's fluffy, people can snort it, and they'll be like, that's fire coke, bro. I've watched that happen before. I have watched someone brag about how fire their cocaine was and before their very eyes tested it as being meth, and the level of betrayal. You've never seen someone crumble until they've pulled out a sack of white powder, put it in front of you saying, this is the best coke this side of the Mississippi. And then you test it and it's amphetamine and you watch all the color drain from their face. And he's like, I bought $10,000 of this. You've never seen someone crumble until that happens. Oh, the system. Then suddenly they're really invested in drug checking. They're like, oh man, I got to get into this one. But not before that. People only care about stuff that's immediately relevant to them. So binders will bind ingredients together, keep them to stick together. In many cases, you just couldn't get something to be in pill form unless you stick something else with it to hold that shape. Or you can bulk up product. And in some ways, this is advantageous because if you have something like a Xanax bar, for instance, at 2 milligrams of Xanax is a tiny, tiny quantity. It's a couple grains of sand. So in order to make it into a pill that isn't literally invisible, you have to add stuff to it. It can also stabilize an active ingredient so it doesn't break down as fast. It can improve the delivery in your system so it gets to your bloodstream faster, or improve the solubility so it absorbs more effectively. These are all things that these inactive ingredients can do. I found this picture on the internet a while ago and I've always kept it in these slides for no reason other than that I just want to know like what its backstory is. And if someone could find out who made the dilution monster and why it looks like this, I will give you like 50 cents out of my pocket. Now, adulteration is generally referred to a substance that has been cut, so it's been adulterated. It contains something that's not what you bargained for. Now, I refer to this as, again, something that's psychoactive, something that mimics the effects of the substance you were promised, which is why people are frequently sold amphetamine as cocaine, because amphetamine will fool most people into thinking that they're on coke. And I'll be like, oh, how long were you high for? And they're like, oh, like 3 hours. I'm like, oh, cool. That's like 6 times as long as coke lasts. Coke is a really, really short experience. I'm like, fuck, God, the amphetamine got me again. You'd think I would have learned, but it's fine. Everyone's just figuring it out. And then there's misrepresentation, which is that the substance just like was sold as something that it's not outright. And these are kind of interchangeable, but it's worth the distinction. So if a pill was misrepresented as Adderall, and it's actually something else, then you could say that it was misrepresented. It was sold differently as it actually is, and it's cut with something else. So just some quick vernacular for this. Adulterated drugs are frequently referred to as being bunk or stepped on or cut. And this process of stepping is usually kind of a tiered thing. You get the product from the source, the grower, the chemist, whatever. The next person they pass it to sprinkles in a little bit of their magic, and a little bit of their magic, all the way down the chain until you have the American standard cocaine purity of 5 to 35%. And that's how that ends up usually going. So people that have fire coke usually have a lot of amphetamine and fillers most of the time. And then there's things like excipients, which are known as binders if they're sticking something together, fillers if they're filling in a space around a small quantity, or diluters if they're giving the dealer the ability to bulk up their product. They only need to sprinkle a little bit in there and they get all this profit, and it's not their fault as a fault of the drug laws. I'm just gonna say that. Okay, so white powder sold as MDMA actually contains only baking soda and caffeine powder. That sucks. The substance is blank because it contains substances other than MDMA. The slang term for this word is what? You can write it in the chat or shout it out.
Molly.
Well, I want to, maybe I should clarify the track that I'm going on right now. What is the word for it when a substance contains something other than what it's supposed to? Starts with an A.
Adulterated.
That's what I'm looking for, adulterated. But I see the confusion there. That's my bad. I see adulterated, and someone has said cut or bunk. That's right. It can also be misrepresented. Baking soda is a blank because it's inactive and meant to bulk up the substance. Caffeine powder is a blank because it's psychoactive and meant to mimic the effects of the drug it's sold as. So there's a different goal with each of these, right? Like if someone cuts something with baking soda, the idea behind it isn't to have someone snort baking soda and be like, wow, this Coke is fire, because hopefully they'd realize that they're completely sober. But if you put caffeine in it, or this is for MDMA, then it's intended to make them feel something, right? I see filler and non-psychoactive. You're in the right track for the first one, but the second one, if something is psychoactive.
An adulterant.
That's right, an adulterant. Okay, so if something is inactive and it's meant to increase the bulk or stick something together or fill the product, it's a diluter, filler, bulking agent. If something is active and it's supposed to enhance or mimic the effects of a substance, it's an adulterant. So let's take a quick look at impurities. Oh my God, we're so close. Yeah, caffeine is the adulterant in that case. Now this is, again, that's kind of nitpicky vernacular. That's just for precision's sake. So if you say that something is adulterated, that generally means it has something that you didn't want in it. If it's adulterated, I think that thing that's in it is psychoactive. There's going to be an effect from it, but it's kind of just like a catch-all term. So impurities that are organic impurities are just a product of the manufacturing process. This is inorganic impurity, sorry. So I'll backtrack to that one. Inorganic impurities are from the environment of the manufacturing process. These are things that can be added in that really aren't supposed to be there while you're making a substance. This can have to do with unclean work environments or using a weird precursor or a weird wash. These are inorganic. They're not just like byproducts of making a drug. Then you have organic impurities. And these are supposed to be there. These are things that are made in the process of making a substance. Now, an interesting thing to note about these organic impurities is that I'm sure some of you are familiar with darker versus lighter Molly, MDMA, darker versus lighter crystals. Now, this is a question that I get asked a lot about what exactly does that color difference mean, and is it still good? And the answer is generally that the darker the Molly, the fewer washes have been done, the more heavy metals remain in that dose of MDMA. So it means that it's been produced in a poorer environment. It can still be fire Molly, it can still be a great experience for you depending on what you want out of it, but the likelihood of there being more heavy metals that haven't been washed off is higher. Is the darker one called SAS? I love Unknown 2018. Yeah, 2018. No. Yes, SAS is MDA, but it's a different substance entirely. SAS is generally darker than MDMA, but can be pure white as well. People tend to identify it, and we'll come back to that actually just in a second. We're gonna, again, run like 1 or 2 minutes over. So just a quick note about adulterants. You start with the manufacturer's drugs, cute little kitten. They don't cost that much because they're coming straight from source. Then you get to the trafficker's drugs. The trafficker has definitely done some shit to these substances. We don't really know what. And by the time we reach the dealer, the foot dealer, that's actually your nice neighborhood guy who rolls up smoking a joint with a snapback on and offers you a bag of shitty weed, they're probably pretty low quality by that point in time. It really depends, but the more steps it takes to get from point A to point Z, the more adulterated something is likely to be, depending on what it is. Not so much with weed. Could one wash an MDMA supplement to purify it? Yes, you can wash many different substances, many different crystalline substances yourself, but you should always be very careful when you do so, because if you do it wrong, you'll be ingesting the things that you use to wash, and that's probably pretty bad. Can you ID drug by its taste? So many people will want to look super cool when they're doing their deal and they stick their pinky in and be like, oh yeah, that's good. Like that tastes like Molly. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how, like, what are you, super tongue? Like you can't do that. You just can't. So lidocaine, for instance, is a numbing local anesthetic. It will numb you in the same way that cocaine does. A lot of people use this as their metric. It doesn't work. By its smell or appearance, these are both different substances. This is MDA on the left, the one that people assume is going to be dark and smell like licorice and root beer. This is MDMA. They're different drugs entirely. They have similar effects in some ways, but they're different substances. Otherwise, they'd both be called MDMA, right? So this is really, 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 really important to internalize. Hope you do so. So like, why am I going on and on about this? I've just given you a lot of reasons why substances aren't pure. Now, for our purposes, I'm going to say that a substance is pure if the psychoactive drug in question only contains it and its naturally occurring byproducts. It doesn't contain things that it's been cut with, things that it's been filled with. It's just that drug and its byproducts. The quality therein can vary, you know, like it's not always going to be great quality, even if it's just that, but that's kind of the metric that I want to use here. And last thing that we're going to note, this is just an interesting thing we're going to look at more later, is the average drug purity by state based on DEA substance seizures. This is a couple years old, but the gist of it stands. And you'll notice here that the purity is really, really, really low on the northern East Coast. Now, here are some major trafficking routes. Do we notice anything? The further you percolate from the source of the trafficking or from the manufacturing, the Dakotas in particular have a lot of home-based manufacturing operations because they're so rural, they're so unregulated. There are a lot of DIY meth labs out there because there's just like the whole thing about environmental toxins too, we'll come back to as well. But it's funny, right? You can literally see the percolation of things getting stepped on and stepped on and stepped on and stepped on as they move further from the source. And this isn't all of the trafficking routes, obviously. These are just some of the major ports that they come in by. That's not relevant to us. Ooh, 10:01 p.m. I've honed this shit to a science. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed today's round of DrugsCo, and we didn't have to do a separate second session this time. That's great. Is that chart for drugs in general? Yeah, it's just like average purity. Yeah, if you have any additional questions, feel free. I will stick around for another minute or two and answer them. You can also email me. Other than that, I will see you guys next Tuesday. I believe next Tuesday we get into neuroscience. So I'm sure that many of you are rearing to go on that one, and I'm very excited. And that slide involves a lot of like Putin heads and some feet and stuff. That's how I explain neuroscience. So gird your loins and have a wonderful night, you guys.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank